What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. I'm coming to you from Motor City, and on today's episode, we've got one of the best storytellers in the NBA media game joining us, a guy who doesn't just cover basketball, he captures the heartbeat of a franchise and the pulse of a city. You've read his work in the Detroit Free Press. You've heard him breaking it all down on the Pistons Pulse podcast. And if you follow the league closely enough, you already know that his name holds weight. Omari Sankofa II has built a reputation for his sharp insight, balanced perspective, and deep connection to the players and culture he covers. From feature writing to film breakdowns to front office context, his reporting consistently brings Detroit basketball to life. Omari Sankofa, welcome to the show.
That was a heck of an intro, first of all. Thank you. Man, I think this is my second time on here. I'm happy to be here, man.
I appreciate you jumping on. We are coming to our listeners after the Cavs' domination of the Detroit Pistons, 116-95, where we saw the Cavs get up to a 35-point lead at one point in this game. And we know coming in, the Detroit Pistons play physical. But in tonight's matchup, the Cavs actually answered the call, something that they haven't done historically. And arguably, they've done best against the Pistons, especially with J.D. Bickerstaff on the other side. What did you take away from tonight's ball game?
Yeah, the Pistons just didn't have it. They were up 2 with like 3 minutes left in the fourth quarter, and then the Cavs ended that quarter with an 11-0 run, and I think it was a 25-2 or a 25-4 run before the Pistons finally got another bucket, and that was almost a full quarter without a field goal. Tonight was just one of those nights. You're going to have these nights over the course of a season where you just lose steam and like don't show up. Essentially, it was both of these teams' third games in 4 nights, and the Pistons were at home, so you really can't use that as an excuse. But they're 2-2. You know, you're going to have bad losses. The next couple of weeks will determine if this is a warning sign or if tonight was just an outlier. But this was comfortably the worst game they've had so far this season.
And obviously, this is the first time that you've gotten to see DeAndre Hunter a part of the Cleveland Cavaliers. He's a guy that the Cavs are still getting acclimated to. And Donovan Mitchell talked after the game about you're starting to see how he is progressing with this unit, the camaraderie that they've built over the summer that they had together. And obviously, he missed the first 2 games of the season. He was on Cade Cunningham to start the game, and he had a productive night defensively, as the Cavs did, as you mentioned, as a whole. What did you take away from the matchup between DeAndre and Cade and just the difficulties that Cade had getting to his spots tonight?
Yeah, DeAndre Hunter, I mean, he's like a big long forward. Like he's a guy that certainly could match up with Cade physically. So it's not the type of matchup where, Cade, like over smaller guards, Cade would just post up and like operate at the rim or mid range or whatever, and he could feast to those matchups. So a little bit different with DeAndre Hunter. Like I think also just the Cavs' overall scheme, shrinking the floor a little bit, challenging guys like Asar Thompson and Ron Holland to knock down threes kind of works against the Pistons, who I think missed Tim Hardaway Jr. and Malik Beasley a little bit. Although Duncan Robinson obviously replaces some of that, but like he's one player, and those are 2 guys who are prolific shooters. So yeah, I mean, Cavs are a good defensive team. They've got 2 great rim protectors. They're going to play in the lanes. They're just going to make life difficult. And Kane just couldn't get it going tonight.
Yeah, and we talked with J.D. Bickerstaff before the game about the overarching view of the league kind of going back to this defensive-minded execution with players guarding 94 feet. And obviously, we know that J.D. Bickerstaff likes that kind of rough and tumble kind of defensive style because of his background. But the Cavs actually utilized that in their second unit when we talked about that first quarter to second quarter where the Cavs held the Detroit Pistons scoreless or without a field goal, I should say, from the 4-minute mark of the first quarter to the 5-minute mark of the second quarter. And Jalen Tyson and Craig Porter Jr., 2 guys that didn't necessarily get a lot of run last year, were pivotal in those matchups. When we talk about the overall landscape of the NBA, what have you noticed of how the defensive structures have changed? And then also just those 2 guys having the game that they did, especially against more experienced players.
Yeah, I think there's more teams just applying for court pressure now, just to delay the amount of time teams can get into their sets. And obviously, if you have a team that's challenged for ball handlers a little bit, they're going to have more issues at times. The Pistons have diversified their offense. We've seen Asar be the primary initiator a lot more than his first 2 seasons, and he's got to relieve some pressure off of Cade. But they don't have Jaden Ivey, who was obviously set up to have a pretty important role on this team, and that's hurt them. So, I think those guys applying full court pressure on Cade. I think they countered by having Stu and Duran bring the ball up a little bit, and that didn't really work out that well. So it's just the league is just so talented offensively now that you basically just have to try everything to, get teams out of their rhythm, and that's one thing that seems to be making a difference. You typically see full court presses in college a lot more, but it's making a comeback in the NBA.
And we talked a little bit about the defensive matchups. I wanted to point to Asara Thompson is arguably one of the better guards in the league when it comes to just facing up against whoever he's against. And Donovan Mitchell is an elite player and an elite shot maker, as we know. He gave Asara a tough time tonight, but dropping 35 points on 13 of 18 from the field. We know what Donovan Mitchell can do and how difficult of a guard he is. What did you see from that matchup and how Asar kind of fell off when it comes to discipline and fouling and all those different things?
Yeah, it wasn't Asar's best game, and he also only played 15 minutes, didn't get a lot of burn in the second half. 4 fouls in that stretch, obviously. So he has some issues. Donovan Mitchell is just a great player. Some of the shots he hit during that third quarter run were just pretty ridiculous. And he just had a night where he got to do whatever he wanted. Those are matchups that Asar typically can handle pretty well. But like again, the team just jointly had no energy today. And I think that also reflected in Asar not having just the best defensive night.
We talked a little bit about the injuries for the Detroit Pistons when it comes to Ivy, but obviously the Cavs were also without Max Strus, Darius Garland, Lonzo Ball, who was out because of his monitored minutes of back-to-backs and not playing in those to start the season at least, but also understanding that Sam Merrill went out in the third quarter with a right hip contusion. Whether or not he'll be available down the stretch is still to be seen. But the injuries around the league are taxing and starting to pile up. We talked pregame with Kenny Atkinson about the 82 game season kind of being shrunk and him saying that he would be down for that and kind of reiterating the fact of what Steve Kerr said in different interviews in the past, like maybe 70, 72 games would allow for a better product for the NBA, would allow players to get more rest, and would allow for fans to be able to have more meaningful games to watch and their favorite players be available more often. What do you think about the dynamic of potentially having a shrunk season and what that could mean for the NBA?
Yeah, somebody who's been through a few 82 game seasons now, you do sort of gain an appreciation for how much of a grind it is. And Kenny Atkinson's point, and I think a point a lot of people would agree with, is that when a team is playing on the second half of a back to back, they're not always going to be at their best just from like a rest standpoint. And because of that, like as a fan, a lot of times you're just going to inherently get like not as good of an experience watching a fatigued basketball team. Like I personally feel like if he went to like 72, that would be more of a sweet spot because you would eliminate some back to backs. You would just eliminate some of the more wild stretches of the season. And like with that, like I think you will see fewer injuries. I think there would be a lot of benefits to that. But I also think in a league that's always been 82 games, you remove games, and now that's gonna mess with stats and whatnot. Hey, the NFL has added games, and just people just accept that you have an extra game. So like some stats are just gonna be a little bit off because of that. Like guys not having an advantage in that category. Although a lot of guys are not playing that 17th game anyway. But long story short, I think it makes sense to shave some games off of the schedule. From a financial standpoint, I don't know if that's feasible, but a lot of people would agree that 82 games is probably a bit excessive. Like I would even argue you could go down to like 64 probably and not miss much just from a quality standpoint. I think that's probably 2, 3 games a week, and guys are at full strength.
Yeah, and obviously the injury management that we've seen throughout the league with Joel Embiid and other teams as well, and then also the Achilles tears that we've seen from Tyrese Halliburton and Damian Lillard and Jason Tatum, like that has kind of raised the awareness of the grueling season and kind of brought coaches to the mindset of needing to speak out on this topic. And I think it's an interesting one. And Kenny Atkinson doing so on his own volition after being asked about the back to backs spoke volumes tonight. And I think it's an important topic that we're going to continue to have throughout the season, especially if these injuries continue to pile up. But Omari, while I have you, I do understand that the Detroit Pistons are a team that are trying to be in the playoff hunt again, trying to have an identity that they can rely on night in and night out. When I ask you this, I'm trying to figure out what the Pistons' goal is for the season, where you see them pictured out, and what kind of threat that they could pose to different teams in the Eastern Conference.
If you ask the players, like they want to take a clear step forward, right? You win 6 games with the Knicks. You got 2 wins at Madison Square Garden, and we're really like a missed call away from making it a 7-game series. So you come back from that, and that gives you confidence that okay, you've arrived, and now next year you actually want to win the playoff series, right? So I think the players see last year as a point that should propel them even further. Coach, GM aren't going to say out loud, like, oh, we have to win a playoff series for the season to be successful, because the reality is that I don't think growth is linear. Teams deal with, sometimes injuries or external factors or financial things that can slow down growth. And it just doesn't help to say, oh, if we don't do this, like we failed, right? But I think they too just want to feel more confident that what they have is worth fully investing in. Most of this roster was not drafted by Trajan Langdon, so he is, I think, in evaluation mode still. Especially for a guy like Asar who came back from blood class last year and played himself back into shape and was on the minute restriction for most of the year. Jaden Ivey like hasn't played a basketball game since January 1st, so there's a lot on him that they still want to see. So, there's just still information to gather on this team, I think, and that's something that the front office has to accomplish this season.
When you look at a fully healthy Detroit Pistons roster, right? I had them on one of my lists for biggest threats in the Eastern Conference to the Cavs, right? Like probably in the top five, top six, top seven of that category when we talk about what they pose, the physicality that we've talked about prior, about what that means to a Cavs team that hasn't responded well to that in recent years. But knowing that they also added the shooting element of Duncan Robinson, and knowing that they also lost a shooting element in Malik Beasley. Where do you feel like this team has grown the most and can make another jump to help them win a playoff series?
Yeah, I think Asar Thompson is the key to a lot of that. Just a guy with his athleticism, like his innate gifts. Even though he had a quieter game tonight, like I thought he still had some nice plays. And, he's somebody I think around the league, people are pretty bullish on having a chance at being in the most improved conversation. He and his brother. And if he's that second star on some level, then, I think that puts you a lot closer to contention where, every contending team now has at least 2 go-to guys. So if that's a Sar Thompson and you find that out, that's huge. So I would say he's a big key to the season. Also, Jalen Duran, still only 21 years old, and this is his 4th season. Uh, he's grown. He still has some growth ahead, but at this point, he's shown, like at very minimum, he's a very productive NBA player, and he's also a guy that I think can eventually step into a bigger role, especially if he can improve his rim protection and operating and drop, but still being able to contest threes and some of the finer nuances of the defensive aspect of the game.
Not to put you on the spot here, but as we get closer to the end of this podcast, I wanted to get your sense of where the Eastern Conference is, right? Because we know Boston and Indiana are kind of going to be in flux, and Milwaukee is interesting because of the whole Giannis situation. Where do you see the Cavs and the Detroit Pistons in the standings this year, and where would you predict the Pistons to end up?
Yeah, I think the Cavs and Knicks are probably the teams that you would predict would finish 1 and 2 in some order. Knicks are, they have a new coach, a new system, so they may have some things they have to iron out to get to that point. And it's still early, so it's tough to get a grasp exactly on where teams are this early. But I think you could see pretty clearly that Boston has some deficiencies that they would have to work on to really be in a conversation. And with that said, I think the Pistons, if you finish anywhere, 3, 4, 5, I think you can feel good about that. Orlando's gotten off to a tough start, but I think they're going to figure it out and be a good team as they figure out how to incorporate Desmond Bain. Atlanta, I think, also is 1-3, but I think they're going to be pretty good. Uh, Milwaukee, I think, is interesting just with Giannis, and maybe you have just enough depth pieces to make it work. But I even think just with Giannis, they're still a playoff team in the East. I think the Toronto Raptors are sort of a fun wild card team because you look at their starting five, and it's not a bad. Like they don't have a bad roster at all. I don't know if it's a roster that could win the playoff series, but like I do think that they could be a playoff team. So if you're the Pistons, like you probably still want to have like that 44 win baseline, finish above 500 again, and if you can get pretty firmly into the playoffs, then like that's probably enough for you to feel pretty secure about what's being built here.
Can you just speak to like slightly the trajectory of this Pistons team? Like we kind of saw it with the Cavs when Jamie Bickerstaff took over. Like they were at rock bottom, and he was able to help them get to a play-in team, a first-round playoff team, and now it feels like this Pistons team is kind of taking the right steps as well. Sure, roster helps, but having a coach that one believes and also has a kind of backbone that the Detroit city can rely on and lean on, it feels like he matches the vibe that Detroit needs.
Yeah, it's been a complete transformation in just 2 years. But they went from 14 wins to 44 wins, and last year came in with no expectations of anything. And honestly, they just got better and better as the year went on. I think Nassar coming back has something to do with that. It was a few things that added to it, but they just really gelled. And they just got to add a spirit to them that enabled them to have one of the biggest season turnarounds of all time. So it was a little bit of an uneven, rough path to get to this point, but it did eventually gel. And like that's how it typically goes. Like OKC was really bad not that long ago. Houston was really bad not that long ago. It takes a few years for things to begin to gel. So I think last year was the first year where they looked cohesive, and you could actually see this team eventually becoming a contender with some more development down the road.
Yeah, and I definitely think because of the gritty nature of the roster, and obviously the Cavs have more room to grow, and the mental toughness is something that we talk a lot about on this show, and trying to find the balance between the offensive skill set and the defensive identity that they've leaned their entire foundation on with Evan Mobley and Jared Allen, as we saw in tonight's game. I think them finding the mental toughness and trying to rid themselves of this soft label, trying to rid themselves of the nice guy label is going to be interesting to see, especially come playoff time. And obviously, when we talk about playing against the Detroit Pistons 3 more times this season, I think those matchups will definitely help test them, especially when the Pistons are a little more healthy and maybe when the Cavs are healthy, because even when this roster is going to change over the season, you're going to have to make those adjustments on the fly. But Omari, I appreciate you hopping on today's podcast. But with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's show of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris, me, and Jimmy by subscribing to Subtext. This is where you can send in your weekly Hey Chris questions. But the only way to do so is signing up for a 14-day free trial or visiting cleveland.com/Cavs and clicking on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word stop. It's easy. But we can tell you, the people who sign up stick around, because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me, Chris, and Jimmy. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.